This highly requested video is a follow-up to a shorter video called From Proto to Old Scandinavia, but I will go much further into depth in this video and explain practically all major sound changes between Proto-Norse and the attested early medieval Old Norse dialects. This video will be very long and have a lot of academic jargon, so be prepared for that. The time period between circa 500 to 800 AD is called the Syncopy age in Scandinavian studies, and it refers to the sound changes where unstressed short vowels were lost. Proto-Norse began undergoing innovations different from West Germanic around this time, that in turn also was breaking up into different languages. Keep in mind that many of the sound changes I mentioned in this video also happen in West Germanic, but at different rates and with different outcomes in different languages, meaning that Germanic as a group becomes highly diversified during these centuries. The sources for the reconstruction of the language around these time periods are internal and comparative reconstruction based on Old Norse, along with related languages such as Old English and Gothic, runic inscriptions in both Elder and Transitional and Younger Futhark, loanwords into other languages like Latin or Finnish, but exact datings and orderings of sound changes such as umlaut are debated among scholars and have been for quite some time. So the chain of events I give here is my perception based on the literature I read, and it also deals with a lot of dialectal variation, but in general it's as presented here. Roman Imperial period, Northwest-Germanic. Several early sound changes are shared between North and West Germanic, and the oldest inscriptions from around 400 AD and earlier are hard to classify as either. Some of these sound changes include the smoothing of unstressed diphthongs such as au and I into o and e, and the shortening of unstressed overlong vowels. Unstressed o also turns into u around this time, and the ending into There are also a number of distinctly North Germanic changes to unstressed vowels. Also, around this time, it's usually believed that final short nasalized vowels lose their nasality and merge with non-nasal vowels. The long vowel e or ä in stressed syllables lowers to a. This is seen in, for example, comparison with Gothic and the other Germanic languages, and it's already present in the earliest runic inscriptions, meaning that it likely happened around the 1st centuries AD. The Germanic voiced s, the z, that developed through Werner's law, seems to have developed into a distinct sound around this time in Northwest Germanic. In West Germanic, it's usually lost word finally and turns into an r sound medially, but in North Germanic it stays as a distinct sound for centuries, but it doesn't turn into a voiced s, a z sound. It's some kind of rhotic fricative that doesn't, for example, devoice to s like it does in Gothic. This sound is traditionally transcribed with a small capital R, called the palatal R. One of the earliest sound changes that happen in Northwest Germanic and has a lot of influence on later dialects is called U-umlaut, which means that stressed short u was lowered to o when followed by a short a in the following syllable. This is a very early change from the time before North and West Germanic split and differs regionally, likely due to paradigm leveling and nearby consonants. U-umlaut also lowered I to E in a handful of words, but it's much less apparent in the sound system. In general, it could be said that the further west you go, the more U-umlaut there is. So, for example, Gutnish completely lacks it, and it's very rare in Eastern Swedish. This sound change would have led to a lot of alternations in various forms, since the lowering only happened in, for example, the nominative and accusative of A-stem nouns. But attested forms like holtiar shows that the lowered vowel has spread throughout the paradigm, meaning that this dialect difference would be quite old. And a good examples of this would be A-stem nouns and the past participle of strong verbs. Hulta or holta, stulinar or stolinar, buda or boda. There are a number of early North Germanic sound changes that seem to predate syncope. One such sound change is final devoicing of stops and also fricatives. turning for example geng into genk, band into bant, and mar into mach in strong verbs, past tense. The imperative also gets devoiced, stand into stant and gang into gank. The diphthong I smooths to a before r and ch, turning saira, which is attested, into sara, eich into ach. The voiceless dental fricative s is lost after n and l, which is lengthened in the process. Finthan into finnan, gultha into gulla. Nasals are also lost before s, turning ons into ons and ansur into ansur. This makes the a rune eventually change value to a. The diphthong au and short u are lowered and smooth before ch, in for example thauch turning into thoch, but this process is not complete in Gutnish, where for example au was unaffected. A few words in North Germanic alternate between u in the west and o in the east. This isogloss is reckoned to be ancient and likely precedes Syncopy. Western boan, troan, ko, Eastern and Gutnish boan, troan, ko. Holtzmann's law or sharpening. North Germanic turned the Proto-Germanic long glides y and w into long stops, g and gw. For example, hauan into hagwan, twajo into twagjo. A similar sound change happened in Gothic, but with a different outcome. Stressed Germanic short e underwent breaking, turning into a diphthong, ea or ea, when a back vowel followed in the next syllable. It was hindered by initial w or r. They were later raised to ia or ja, but this is much later. A similar process also affected short i before w clusters, but this sound change is harder to date and likely much later. Examples of breaking include ertho into jortho, helpan into hjalpan. The rules for breaking are somewhat different between Eastern and Western Scandinavia, where Western Scandinavia generally only breaks short e in heavy syllables, but in Eastern Scandinavia also short syllables are affected, which creates one of the classic isoglosses within Scandinavia between Old East Norse jak and Old West Norse ek. From now on, unstressed vowels begin to elide and be dropped, beginning the syncope period. Step 1, circa 500 AD, asyncope. The first stage of syncope was the loss of final short a. This vowel was lost regardless of stem length, but it was preserved if followed by a nasal as a. It was always lost before r, s or t. Steina and horna turn into stein and horn, making a-stem singular nouns, accusative and nominatives monosyllabic. The prefix ga, which later on was completely lost, was contracted to a simple g, turning a word like galikar into glikr. The glides in ja stems, ia stems, and wa stem nouns and adjectives became vowels. Rikia, riki, harjar, harir, garwar, garur. I-umlaut or J-umlaut, also called front mutation. Before an unstressed I or J, back vowels O, O, and A are fronted to Y, Ö, and Ä. The exact rules and conditions for I-umlaut are complex and contentious in North Germanic, and I-umlaut fluctuates dialectally. In general, long stems ja and ir are steadily umlauted in all words. For example, O into Ö, sokian into sökian, gronir into grönir, A into Ä, malian into malian, gasir into gasir, iu and U into Y, hliudian into hlydian, musir into mysir, U into Y, fullian into fyllian, kunjumr into kynjumr, A into Ä, langira, lengira, gastir, gastir, Au into Ei, chlaupir, chleipir. Nasal assimilation before voiceless stops. Sometime around the loss of short a, nasals were lost before voiceless stops. The outcomes depend on dialect. In the west, it's regular, and less so in the east, and in Dalecarlian, ank and ant are rounded. This sound change is hard to date based on runic inscriptions, because nasals are often not written before consonants, but the fact that verbs like wenta and wanta, which used to have a medial vowel, don't undergo this process shows that this must precede syncope of short medial a. Some examples of this process are thanko into thakko, bankir into western bekkir, eastern benkir, drank into drakk, wintrur into wintrur in the east, and wettrur in the west. This process is quite diverse dialectally, and the border roughly goes through western Sweden, like many different sound changes. U or W umlaut, also called back mutation. Before an unstressed U or W, the vowels A and A are rounded to O and O. This was fully regular in western Scandinavia, less in the east, and is mostly absent in Gutnish, meaning that it's a western sound change to begin with. This is particularly obvious in neuters and feminines. For example, neuter plural of nouns, lando and saro into londo and soro, and neuter plural and feminine nominative singular adjectives, spako, fagro, alnaro into spoko, fogro, alnoru. Around this time, it's estimated that the diphthong au rounds to o. There's also a mixed U and I mutation, which is mostly productive in the West, turning garguyan into gurguyan, sankuyan into sukkuyan. But this is only found in a few words. And the verb garguyan has a lot of different outcomes in Old Norse, regardless of dialect. Assimilation of word medial h and w. After I umlaut, but before most of the syncope, word medial w and h were lost with lengthening of the preceding vowel. W was, however, kept in inflected forms of the word. Trewa into tre, knewa into kne, sehan into sean, fehu into fe or feu, fawar and hrawar into far and hrar. A word like spohu turns into spo, a word like tiwar turns into tiur, later tir or tyr. The diphthong I had a specific development before W into a fronted ä, saiwar into saur. But there's a lot of paradigm leveling, and the W pops up again when the word is inflected and has two syllables. Loss of word final nasals. Shortly after asyncope, word final nasals are dropped, generating nasal vowels that merge with the already existing nasal vowels in stressed syllables. Word final nasalized vowels are generally resistant to syncope and were likely pronounced as long. Verb endings such as werthan and skulun turn into werthan and skulu. End-stem oblique forms like hagan and quenun turn into hagan and quenon. Prepositions like an and fram turn into a and fra. In Eastern Scandinavian and Gutnish, final n is actually preserved in final subjunctive in and the neuter end-stem plural un. Step 2, circa 600 AD. I and U syncope after heavy stems. The second stage of syncope was the loss of short U and I after heavy stems, a change that happened after umlaut had been operational, making Y, Ö, Ä and O new phonemes. For example, A-stem neuter plurals with long stems such as londo and soro turn into lond and sor. Long stem feminine adjectives and nominative singular become monosyllabic. Leuvo turn into leuv. Long stem first-class weak verbs also allied their medial I, turning fyllide into fyllde. It's around this time that I umlaut phonemizes in I-stem nouns, such as gastir into gestr, and adjectives like grönir into grönr. It's likely that it's around this time that a lot of paradigm leveling and dialectal differentiation happens with regards to I umlaut, in, for example, nouns with long stems, since there are often doublets in Old Norse dialects of nouns with and without I umlaut. Loss of initial y before vowels and w before rounded vowels. Later in the syncope era, glides are dropped at the start of words. Y is lost everywhere, and slightly later w before rounded vowels, sometimes even before o from U-umlaut. Examples of the loss of word initial y are jar and jungr and jok turning into ar, ungr and ok. And the y rune, which takes its name from the word jar, year, changes value to a. The loss of w before rounded vowels also creates alterations in verb paradigms. Werthon, warth, wurdon turn into werthon, warth, urdu, which shows that the past tense plural form drops the w. Many common words like wolfr turn into ulfr, which is still seen in comparison to words like English wolf today. Assimilation of clusters following syncope. Following syncope of many medial vowels, awkward homorganic clusters were assimilated into long consonants. This was common and regular in weak verbs and adjectives. Födido into födo, satido into satto, godat into got, ainatkin into eintki, thauhin into thögi, gevint into gevit. It's around this time that the Scandinavian indefinite pronoun developed from the phrase ne vaitequat, which is ground down to nokut or naquat. Syncope of medial vowels before an inflectional ending. Short medial vowels that were before a grammatical ending with a long vowel and secondary stress were dropped, creating alternations in inflectional paradigms. For example, a noun like aftanar in nominative singular becomes aftans in singular, but aftanor in plural turns into aftnor. Aftane in dative turns into aftne in dative, creating an alternation. Some nouns with a medial n, like the genitive plural of woman, quenono, turns into quenno, which is quite different from the other oblique forms, quenno. Loss of inflection on y after heavy stems. After the loss of I after heavy stems, the alternation I and y created by Siever's law was lost, and remaining y after heavy syllables were only kept following g and k or vowels. This creates a split in long stem weak verbs, creating alternations like födjan and kanjan turning into föda and kenna, but sökjan and thykjan remaining sökja and thykja. The Germanic diphthong eu is attested in the early inscriptions, but its development differs depending on region in Scandinavia. In eastern Scandinavia, it's raised to eu, but in western Scandinavia, it undergoes a complex split into eo before dental consonants and eo elsewhere, and it raises to y next to a palatal r. Gutnish turns it into yao everywhere. Merger of intervocalic fricatives. Around the 700s, word medial and final voiceless f and th merge with their voiced counterparts v and th. This did not affect g, since medial and final ch was likely h at this time. For example, verbs like thurfa and hava used to have difference in voicing, but merged into thurva and hava around this time. There is also a merger of minimal pairs like doutha and doutha into doutha. The alternation of v and f and th and th is lost around this time, with the voiceless fricatives merging with their voiced counterparts intervocalically in word finally, meaning that a word like wertha turns into wertha. Assimilation and influence of palatal R next to dentals and vowels. The sound called palatal R, likely a kind of r sound from Proto-Germanic z, developed in specific ways next to different sounds. Following a dental, like in for example masculine nouns, with a syncopated vowel, the preceding dental consonant simply lengthened, and after the sounds th, d and t, it merged with r. This sound also assimilated before dentals, lengthening them also in the process. Awkward clusters that were unpronounceable due to syncope dropped the inflectional r. U-umlaut is the fronting of vowels before the so-called palatal r, which gets its name from this process. Ur into yr, diur into dyr, korrin into körin, harri into herri, thar into thär. Step 3, circa 800s AD, I and U syncope after light stems. The last stage of the syncope was the loss of final I and O after light stems. Around this time, long unstressed vowels are also shortened. This syncope makes many short stem nouns monosyllabic, like for example A-stem neutral plurals like skipo into skip, U-stem nominative accusative singular, sunu into sun, feminine O-stem and nominative adjectives, soku and spoko into sok and spok, and present tense singular of short stem verbs also become monosyllabic, sitir and givu into sitr and give. I-stem masculine singulars also become monosyllabic, winir into winr, but this contrasts with the I-stem plurals that used to have a long vowel, winir turning into winir, and this shortening of unstressed long vowels is likely the origin of the Scandinavian pitch accent system. This chart shows the rough outline of the developments of unstressed vowels from Proto-Norse to Old Norse, and it clearly shows that the 3 unstressed vowels of medieval Scandinavian are the result of many different unstressed endings merging in the pre-literary period, creating a lot of syncretism in the grammatical system. For example, the short a in endings could derive from several different endings in Proto-Norse. Some vowels were also resistant to syncope depending on their consonant environment and secondary stress. And it's also worth mentioning that most unstressed prefixes, apart from the negative un, are completely lost. But poetic and of in early poetry seems to recall Germanic ga. Final loss of non-initial h. The voiceless fricative h, likely h at the time, is lost before consonants and word finally. This happens late, however, as there are several loans into English from the Danelaw that still show it. For example, slachtr turns into slatr, dochtir turns into dotir, döchter turns into dötr, thå turns into thå, mah turns into ma, lah turns into la, rätter turns into rätter, slihter turns into sletter, and so on. While similar at a first glance, it's not the same thing as Icelandic pre-aspiration. That happens to all long voiceless stops. Various minor changes. Some of these changes are sporadic and only occur in certain words and inflected forms due to consonant environments, but they are mostly nonetheless regular and sometimes leveled out through analogy. Raising of nasal o into o, which is seen in, for example, the feminine pronoun hon into hon. The merger of and vn, which is quite dialectally complicated. The shift from long n plus r into zr, in, for example, onrum into odrum and manr into madr. Eastern Scandinavia, sometimes this becomes mandr instead. There's also some shortenings of overlong syllables that develop due to syncope, in particular in unstressed position. For example, helga turning into helga, fleisk turning into fläsk, and the masculine pronoun han turning into han, which makes sense because it was often unstressed. The bilabial voice fricative v is often lost before rounded vowels, which makes sense because it's very similar in articulation. Seovo turns into seo or seo, beovor turns into bior or bior. But some of these forms are restored due to other inflected forms, which for example doesn't happen in seo or seo because it's not inflected, unlike many other words. A vowel following a W is sometimes rounded and absorbs the W, in, for example, quena, 12, and quam turning into konna and tolv and kom. This sound change is much less common in Gutnish, and it could also be added that short o in dialects like Eastern Old Swedish mostly comes from this sequence and not from Germanic u. Around this time there are also a number of changes to diphthongs, but this seems to vary depending on region. The diphthong öj from I-umlaut of au is rounded to öj in most dialects. The diphthongs o and ei are often fronted to ö and i in many parts of Scandinavia too, in particular Eastern Scandinavia. There is also a sporadic lowering of unstressed I to e in, for example, mid and is into med and s. But this sound change also doesn't happen in Old Gutnish. The velars g and k are lengthened before j, but since this j only occurs in inflected forms, but this is, for example, restored in verbs like säga that has its long j replaced with a short r from the present tense form. Viking Age. Various dialectal changes. Vowel balance and vowel harmony. Following the loss of short i and u after short stems, the shortening of long unstressed vowels, and the loss of nasality in unstressed syllables, the surviving final vowels merged into 3. These had various realizations depending on environment, like syllable weight or consonants, and differed between dialects. In early Old Icelandic, they're mostly spelled as a, e, o, later a, i, o, and in Old Gutnish, they're only spelled as a, i, o. But in Old Swedish and Norwegian, they often show up at different values depending on syllable structure and root vowels. In Old Swedish and Norwegian, vowel balance is common, meaning that the vowels get a more open pronunciation after heavy syllables, which is for example seen in konu and bodhi versus tungo and hose. In Old Norwegian, a system of vowel harmony developed, where the root vowel's height influences the final vowel. Ljose but hosi, ljosom but hosum. Eastern Scandinavian dialectal developments. These changes are dated to around the Viking Age in Eastern Scandinavia, but not all dialects, and many of these changes also happen in Gutnish. One typical Viking Age Scandinavian sound change is the insertion of b and d before l and r in inflectional endings, for example kumbel and andrir. The vowel known as E2 in Northwest-Germanic, which is mostly found in the word here and the past tense of class 7 strong verbs, diphthongizes to ia, in particular in Gutnish and Eastern Swedish and Northern Swedish dialects, which creates pronunciations like hiar, compared to other dialects with her or her. In both Old Danish and Swedish, words like geta and giva are raised to gita and giva. The demonstratives that and than become thet and then in practically all of Eastern Scandinavia already early on. The distinct O vowel from U-umlaut is lacking or leveled out in most of Eastern Scandinavia in complex ways that seems to differ a lot depending on dialect, turning sock and ol into sack and ull. Long e and ä are merged unless followed by a vowel in practically all of southern Scandinavia, including Denmark and Götaland, turning fe and tre into fä and träk. There's also a raising of U-umlauted å before velar clusters, in for example hogwa turning into hogva. H is lost before r, l and n. This happens first in Denmark and reaches Sweden slightly later. Another change that begins early in Denmark, around the 900s, and spreads northwards, is the monophthongization of ei, ö, and öj, turning stein, döder, möj into sten, döder, mö. But this does not happen in all of the Eastern Scandinavian dialect continuum, since there are dialects in, for example, northern Sweden and Finland even today without this change. Western Scandinavian dialectal developments. These changes are dated to around the Viking Age and early Middle Ages in Norway. One typical Western Scandinavian change is the early merger of palatal and regular R in all positions. And this palatal R is never dropped, which often happens in Eastern Scandinavian, turning þeir and sjálfur and hennar into þeir, sjálfur and hennar. This is already completed in the runic period. Another change that happens in Western Norway, but not Eastern Norway, is the loss of W before R, turning Vreiðr and Vranger into Reiðr and Ranger. But early Skaldic poetry shows that this pronunciation was still found in West Norse originally. A stress shift happens in West Norse in vowel hiatus. Sea and threa turn into sja and thra. There is also a lengthening of back vowels before L following a consonant, which likely means that the L was velarized. But this only happens in Western Norway and Iceland, turning ulvr into ulvr, sjálfr into sjálfr. It's also around this time that the merger of v and initial w into v begins in Western Scandinavia, turning vevja into vevja. But this sound change takes centuries to even reach Eastern Scandinavia, where it's not even completed today. From this point on, around the early medieval period, the various North Germanic dialects begin to take shape as distinct languages. And to keep on explaining different sound changes, I would have to go into the separate histories of Swedish, Danish, Norwegian and Icelandic.